This time on An Architect's Perspective, I sit down with Abe Rogers inside Wimbledon House, the private home Richard and Sue Rogers built for Richard's parents in the late 1960s. Conceived as a livable experiment in prefabrication and high-tech modernism, it contained the DNA of Richard's entire career. We explore the house's construction, its ongoing adaptability, and how ideas first tested here would later inform the Pompidou Centre, the Lloyd's Building, the O2 Arena, and beyond. Let's begin.
We are here in the Wimbledon House at 22 Parkside in Leafheath, West London, with the designer Abe Rogers. This house was designed by his parents in 1967. Our conversation with Abe sets out to explore some of the history behind this unique and seminal home. By way of introduction, Abe leads a multidisciplinary design studio called Abe Rogers Design. ARD has worked across all building typologies at various scales in a variety of countries. Some of his projects include such notable buildings as the Fat Duck, Comme des Garçons, Maggie's Royal Marsden, Centre Pompidou, and the Tate Modern. Abe was born in 1968. His mother is the architect Sue Rogers, and his late father is the architect Richard Rogers. Richard went on to win such accolades as the Pritzker Prize for Architecture and the Royal Gold Medal. Sue and Richard were founding partners of the architectural practice Team 4, along with Norman Foster and Wendy Cheeseman. The practice started in 1959 and ended in 1965. After Team 4 had dissolved, Abe's parents founded Richard and Sue Rogers Architect. Abe, it's great to be with you here today.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Hey, before we start today, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about yourself in your own words.
Yeah, I'm an industrial designer by background, though the majority of the work we do is interior and architecture. We had a great privilege to do Maggie's and for the Royal Marsden, and in that process we really developed a whole take on the idea of hospital design and design that really cares for you. We have a concept which we call the third carer. So the principal carer, the first carer is the doctor, the nurse, the janitor. The secondary carer becomes the family, the friend, how the building can be the third carer, how it can really hold you. We know that if you can see a tree outside your window, you need 20% less pain relief. You know, if you have access to a guardian, the speed of recovery is hugely sped up. So it's really taking those principles forward.
You mentioned that one of the things that Richard, the architect for this house, was, I guess, famed for was his idea that it should be everyone's basic human right to have a tree visible from their bedroom. Is that so?
That is absolutely so. And to plant 1 million trees across London, which I think has now been achieved. But we sit here, we look to the right, we see the silver birches and a whole collection of trees and vegetation almost breaking into the window. And we look to the left and we see this giant old tree. And it's this idea of the influence of the kind of harshness of modern architecture and the transparency of the windows and the access to the outside and how it comes in and how we can blur those boundaries.
Great. Hey, would you be able to explain a little bit more about the house, the tectonics of it, and how the spaces are arranged?
I mean, the house was completed in 1969, and it's designed for this retired couple, his mother and his father, a doctor and a potter and a cook. And it's designed, to retire in, so not to have any stairs, to have easy access. So he creates this iconic object almost as a house.
Some of the components in the facade are sort of off-the-shelf components. Certain components had been used in buses and such like. Maybe you could just talk about the facade and the components used.
The concept of Parkside comes out of Zip Up, and Zip Up was about completely prefabricated, manufactured housing, which sits on legs above the ground, so minimum foundations. So when he came to make this house, he didn't have the volume to go into manufacturing specific components. So he thought the next best thing he could do was to look at the industry, at what already exists. So the refrigeration vans is there to keep the cold in and to keep the heat out. So he replaces the traditional walls with refrigeration insulation panels. Rather than being 300 mil thick or 30 centimeters, he goes to 8 centimeters thick. So they become this much lighter. They're almost placed like clothes, very dry, and they're zipped up with neoprenes together to create the seal. And then to enter the house, he uses a system from buses where he creates these prefabricated doors in this very beautiful stainless system, which is then plugged into the building. And even the pieces of glass, which are all single pieces of float glass, there were old ones before that now many of them are blown, had the dimples where they would hold the glass into the they pull it, they would hold it there as it came out of the
Almost
water.
expressing the manufacturing
Everything,
in order.
absolute honesty everywhere. You see the cargo written on the steels.
Yeah.
You see the aluminium. Nothing is hidden.
Yeah.
Everything is there, so you can understand how it's constructed. Very, very different from Creek Veen. Therefore, there's no contextualization. It's kind of placed in space. The garden is planted around it rather than the building adapting to the landscape. It's that kind of that reverse in a way.
So everyone's aware, Creek Veen, for the people that don't know, is now a Grade 2 listed house that your mum and dad were involved as part of their practice team for with Norman Foster and Wendy Cheeseman, just to set some perspective.
Exactly. Built an earlier project in 1963. And I think that was really about craft, using poor materials and high craft to create these very complex angles and skylights. And the three things that really come out of that: one is the house nearly bankrupted the builder, the architect, and the client, as my dad always said. And the other is it still leaks today. And I think he thought, I need a different type of architecture to move forward. So that house is magnificent. I grew up in that house. I mean, it's incredibly beautiful, but it is problematic as he saw it. And he wanted to create something much more accessible and more with greater sense of socialism. So I think in 1967, if my dates are right, they win the ideal standard competition for social housing, this idea of the zip-up house. And then they take that concept of the zip-up house, which is about using these prefabricated components, zipping them together in this endless way, is about an interior which is open to be determined by the inhabitants and an exterior which was never frozen, can always be extended. Mm-hmm. And he then manifested that into this house, which is 22 Parkside. And of course, there's the second house.
Spencer House.
The Spencer House,
yeah.
Which has very, very similar ideas.
Yeah.
And for me, the thing about this house, which is so powerful, is this collection of components that are brought together as industrial fabrication, which has not really been done before in the same way.
So we have these wonderful I-beams on modules, and the idea is that it could be expanded out either left or right. And we see the iconic colour scheme. And I think, as we've alluded to, it's a plan which allows a completely free space that adapts. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you have seen this house adapt. I mean, you were kind of born at the time that this house was finished, and you've had the pleasure of living here with your children, and you've worked here. Maybe you could just speak about the changes that you've seen over the years.
I mean, Richard always really believed that the grid of the architecture, the exterior grid, should not hold the interior. So there's a very interesting play between making sure that the interior is not subservient to the exterior that he plays here. And that idea is really that as different people inhabit the house, they can use it in a different way. So we were talking before about the spine of the sliding doors not lining up with the mullions. And that was the idea that someone might come in here in 10 years' time and take out this interior and put a different interior in. And so it shouldn't be dictated to by the exterior. But the key to, I think, what you're really talking about is the fact that this is a glass box. Whatever it contains becomes the interior. So the colours have never changed because the colours are so magnificent, but it's always been a family connection. I think if somebody else came into the building, they would change the colour scheme and they'd want to make it their own colour scheme. But the colour scheme is only one thing. What really identifies the interior is the objects that it contains. It's a glass box, so you see into it. So you put a collection of Victorian chairs and a Victorian table, it feels like one thing. You bring in a series of kind of very wild, very bright coloured pop objects, which I had in my period, and it becomes another. You make it this incredibly elegant interior of plants, green growing, giant loudspeakers, Italian modernist furniture, and architectural modernist furniture like Eames and Korb, and you create a very different interior.
Yeah. You mentioned colour. Obviously, if someone thinks of Richard's work, you think of colour. It's hard not to. Can you talk a little bit about how that conversation was had with your grandmother, the client, and her understanding and appreciation of colour?
Well, I would like to go back a stage further than that, because I don't know if colour was always attributed to Richard's work. And I think in the Yale drawings, we see an absence of colour. We see incredible thinking. We see great notions about creating community and social housing. In Murray Road, we don't really see a lot of colour. In Creek Veen, there is one piece of colour, which is the only lightless space in the building, which is this toilet by the kitchen, which is this amazing orange-red. And I would go, as a child, I found this space really fascinating, because it's almost trying to compensate for the lack of light to put this amazing piece of colour in the toilet. But also, the house was an art collector's house. My grandfather and grandmother were art collectors. So they would be full of the colour of the paintings. And he would wear quite bright coloured suits. And so he had the colour of the clothes. So the house is not just contained, colour in the house is not just on the walls, but it's also in what we wear and the art that we introduce it to. So I suppose that brought kind of elements of life and colour to it. But I think here, definitely, Dada, Richard's mother, was very part of the colour creation.
For those who are listening, maybe you could just try and describe the colour palette used here.
The colour palette used here, we start with the giant goalposts in the yellow I-beams, and we want to identify those. And they're in this very kind of lemon yellow, Richard would call it sunshine yellow, that comes across. And then, we're sitting in this house which has this amazing green lawn and green plants at the end, and those get incorporated in these large sliding panels. And then we have the secondary yellow, which becomes this much more eggier yellow, and that's for the very solid, bulky parts of the building. So it's the egg, it's the sunshine, and it's the grass that comes together. And then we had this butterscotch floor, which has come about years and years of being corrupted by the sun and turning from white to butterscotch. And what becomes particularly interesting is where things are covered up, they stay in this much whiter colour. So it's this narration of these 3-4 different colours coming together. And then another yellow of the blinds that we pull down. And Richard always attributed the colour scheme to Dada. I mean, I think colour in Richard's, when Richard really gets going in his work, it really becomes about a system to identify the legibility. So in order to see the beams in the Pompidou, in order to see the Gerbrettes, in order to see the services, we start to use colour and contrast. And, I always love the whole notion of the blue pipes carrying, translating directly from the drawing, where blue means air, and then we take the blue onto the air pipes. Red being fire, we take the red onto the air pipes. And this is this very simple translation of diagrammatic colours. And that's very, very Richard. And when colours gets most interesting for me is when we get to Baracas Airport.
And just for the audience, this is in Madrid.
This is Madrid Airport.
Yeah, which is a phenomenal building.
Absolutely, for me, one of his really great buildings. And it's a kilometre-long building, and he chooses to paint the beams 52 different colours.
It's 52, is it?
Across a 52-coloured rainbow.
Yeah.
So as you're passing through, you can say, I'm going to meet you in the red zone, or I'm going to meet you in the yellow zone. But also, it kind of reflects a little bit on, not that Brunel used rainbows, but this celebration of the structure, and the colour celebrates the structure. So it's all the colour in those buildings always has a kind of secondary purpose of identifying the structure, of celebrating the travel that goes through it.
The house has undergone some minor changes over the years. If we look back at the drawings, we can see a carport, which is in the building closest to the road. And we understand in 2017, some quite major refurbishment was carried out. I think it's always good to look back and see and reflect upon how those changes were carried out and potentially the success of those changes. But maybe we could share your insight into how this house has evolved over the years.
Yeah, I can do a very brief plotted history, starting when the house was first constructed. And you said there was a carport, but there was also a pottery and a small bedroom. And then the first alliteration saw the carport being closed off and it becoming a full flat where Dada's younger son, Peter Rogers, lived. And then over time, Richard's partner moved in, John Young, and lived there. And then I think in 95, I moved in there and we did a small refurbishment, nothing very elaborate. And my granny is in here, and we had, and then, alas, she died in 98. And then, in 99, and then we moved into here at some point. And it was extraordinary to see the transformation of the house.
This is you and your two daughters?
This is me, this is before my two daughters.
Right, sorry.
This is me and my wife, Sophie Brainbridge,
right.
At the time. We move in and we're very nervous. We think we're just going to come here for 6 months. We're very nervous about the kind of ghosts that live here. And then we realize that really the new objects that we bring in dominate the house in a very different way. And our lifestyle and our energy, because it's quite chameleonic, the house is quite like a chameleon or an octopus. It changes with the spirit that's inside it. And over the times we have daughters, the daughters grow up, they need separate rooms. So then we do some customization with some color. And Richard would always pretend to be very uninterested. And then he would be really obsessively interested. And then at a certain point, we build a a house at the end of the garden because, the house is fantastic for a retired couple, but for parents with two becoming teenage daughters, there's no acoustic privacy. So it was just somewhere for other people to hang out, of different things to happen. So we built a little house at the end of the garden.
In what style?
Well, it was in conversation with this, but have curved corners rather than mitered. Richard never liked it.
I was going to say, what was Richard's take on
No,
it?
he didn't like it.
Is that why it's not here now?
That is why it's not here now at all. And I think it was, it was complicated. This is such a masterpiece. And it can, for me, one of the important things of this house is it contains all the DNA of Richard's house. And so in hindsight, I should have done something completely different. I should have done a wooden shack. I should have done something which had but I was kind of trying to do something sat in between these different conversations. And it's.
And this is a house not just designed, I think it's important to note, by Richard. It was Richard and Sue. So
yeah.
What was Sue saying?
No, Sue was much more liberal. But what was amazing about this house is it was really warm and it really worked. And it was, everything was double glazed and the sliding door. And when I was here, I started replacing, when the glass panels would go, I would replace them with double glazed panels just to try to find ways to update the house. And when Richard took it back, to my amazement, and Richard was not sentimental about anything in the world except this house. And he really went back against technology and took it back as you would as a piece of conservation to its, and with not really challenging the flaws, but trying to restore it to its former glory in a way.
That's an interesting point. David Chipfield's done a piece. He's worked closely on a building by Mies van der Rohe in Berlin. And, he sort of says, well, who am I to try and correct Mies's details?
Because this became this catalogue of this design of this extraordinary moment that contains all the DNA of his building. We talk about the Pompidou, we talk about legibility. Well, this is definitely legible. We see every structural beam, every honest detail. We talk about the programme, the interior programme being free from the architecture. That occurs in both. We talk about inside to out. The building is completely inside to out. So all this thinking, all this DNA that goes on to define his career is kind of starts here. So it became this incredibly precious kit of parts. So in my kind of, at times, clumsy attempts to modernize it, I was using his words rather than his emotion. Because his words would say, update it, modernize it. But his emotion would say, keep it the same. Please change nothing.
So he was having almost a battle with himself as the years.
I think so.
That's very interesting.
I spoke about everything with Richard, and we curated it. I co-curated a lot of his shows. I think this was a conversation he couldn't have about this kind of sentimentality because it was so contrary to his key philosophy. His key philosophy was to continue to learn, to champion change, to build buildings which could be updated along the way.
We've spoken quite a bit about Richard's relationship with the building since it was designed, his sentimentality and such like. What about your mother's? How is she viewing this building as the years go by?
I think my mother was very proud of the architecture that they created. She was very proud of the confidence of this new template for kind of modern living. She saw it as being something which represented both of their kind of socialist views and finding new ways to build less extravagant architecture with new materials. And she still completely champions that. And they shared that manifesto, they shared that ambition.
Sure.
Her work developed in a very different direction. So I don't think it'd be fair to say this contained the DNA of Sue's future work in the way that it did of Richard's. And this was a moment of discovery from Creek Veen and Murray Road to here was this moment of transition. This to the Pompidou, and then to Lloyd's, and then.
I think the other thing to maybe reflect upon is that Richard's work, to me anyway, was a lot about collaboration, whether it be Team 4, whether it be Renzo Piano. I think Richard probably celebrated his directors and partners within his office perhaps more than maybe Foster and Partners or whoever it may be. Do you think that's a fair reflection?
I think it's a very fair reflection. And, as soon as Richard would start a project, he would bring the engineer in, and he'd be very particular, be it Peter Rice, be it Chris Wise. He'd bring in these maverick minds, put a collection of maverick minds together and really push things forward. Yeah. And he would continue questioning until the last moment.
Yeah.
He was never too late to change, to improve, to make things better. And which is that kind of anti-sentimentality, this drive for excellence, which would drive other people nuts because they'd be like, Richard, we need to build this building. He'd be like, it could be little bit better.
I think it's also important to notice you mentioned Peter Rice, and for those that don't know about Peter Rice, he was an Irish structural engineer trained at Queen's University, and he's the only structural engineer to win the Stirling Prize, which is fascinating.
And the Sydney Opera House would not exist had he not been able to rationalise Winston's structure to make it buildable.
Yeah, I think he's one of the youngest partners at Uvara, structural engineers. So yes, Richard was a big collaborator with Peter Rice, and that's really interesting.
And they would just make each other smile. They were like, Renzo, Richard, Peter, they were like best friends and kids. And that was such an important bit. That's not to say they wouldn't have fights like you do as a kid, but the idea was always the most important thing. How can we get the best idea? How can we make this really work? How can we get this radical concept into reality?
Your father and mother started designing this house in 1967. In order to help understand this house a little more, let's set the context. In the year of 1967, Harold Wilson was in power. The Beatles released Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the devaluation of the sterling was taking place under a Labour government. Probably most importantly for the understanding and appreciation of this house was the looming British housing crisis. Would you say that this was correct?
I think this was absolutely correct. And it's interesting that we still have a looming British housing crisis some 57 years later.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of housing that's pledged by the current government that we need is phenomenal. And yet, maybe I don't think many of the ideas that we see here have really been taken on board. We still have houses made from brick and a lot of wet trades that are slow to build, costly, environmentally questionable. So somehow, as Richard has said on record, this hasn't really solved the housing crisis in the way that he had hoped.
I mean, Richard was really fascinated by the housing crisis. He really believed in human-centered architecture. He really believed that everybody should have a house and every house should have a tree. And, and this was absolutely key to his thinking. But he had problems getting developers on board to realize this ambition. He wanted to go far away from the kind of the brutalist houses of Goldfinger, our great heroes, to create a much more light, dynamic structure that could be changed and transformed. This idea of the zip-up house, but he couldn't drive it through. I mean, I think his influence on social housing is seen in all the papers he wrote with Urban Task Force, is seen in the brilliant books like City for a Smaller Planet, etc. But he never managed to solve that one problem. And I think that he would love to have. And that, I think with the right government, at the right moment, with the right technology, it would have happened.
It's almost interesting to reflect that some of his ideas were realised better in the higher end property than actually the social housing which he so strived to solve. And I think that's maybe something he would reflect upon as a bit of a missed opportunity, that he was almost able to apply these ideas to developers who were able to bring forward housing but at the higher level.
Yeah. I think that is a complicated issue, which I feel hard to talk about without him being here to defend. But I suppose there is parts of that architecture is based on these very, very sophisticated mechanical systems, which become economically viable on a giant airport, but less so once you start to build individual apartments. And that was the whole idea of the treehouse and the Korean industrial housing. It was a really simplification of it. Mm-hmm. For me, one of the key buildings is the Dome, and the Dome is one of the most inexpensive buildings per square meter of any buildings. It's so vast that the roof is lighter than the air that it contains. So he managed to achieve these projects these large industrial projects. He could find ways to completely revolutionize the construction system. We were talking before about Barracas, but I think that happens again in Barracas. But I think on housing, that I think the builders weren't brave enough to take on this different type of architecture. It was too much friction. You needed someone that could really believe in the system. Yeah.
Well, I would then be interested, putting you on the spot, top sort of five buildings that Richard designed in reverse order.
So if I was to go backwards, I would say, of course, Chateau Lacoste, which is small and exquisite. I would then look at the Tree House, which is this concept for social housing built from a series of boxes created from cross-laminated timber. I always want to say TLC, but that's the wrong way around.
CLT.
Tender love and care. And then before that, I would say Barracas, because I think it's an incredible, radical gesture towards kind of almost Brunel-like love of travel, the celebration of colour, the long platforms, the glass, the skylights that come in, the progression of light, and the kind of systemization, which makes it such a joy to travel. I would then go to the Dome, which I think is an incredible building, so simple, produced so swiftly, produced for a year and still there 25 years later. And again, it's this idea that the interior is free to be determined by the user. So it's a tent, it can be an expo, it can be an exhibition, it can be a music
venue,
etc. I would then probably go to Korean housing, another concept for social housing, unbuilt because of its braveness, we can say. Lloyd's, I think is such a magnificent building and so experimental in its times, and everything from the bespoke glass that filters light so you can see, you have light passing through, but you can't see out. And then the Pompidou.
Which I think has to be probably, although this house is highly seminal and you probably wouldn't have the Pompidou Centre unless this house was here, but I think probably the Pompidou is the seminal piece.
Yeah, I think Pompidou completely is the piece. For me, it contains everything.
Yeah.
The gift of the square, the piazza, the activity, the streets into the sky, the legibility, the completely column-free interior that allows the curator to dictate.
Yeah, the idea of openness in architecture and integration of public space, it's a sort of holy grail.
Yeah, completely. But I think Pompidou, it gets pretty close to the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
And Richard always tells that very lovely story of it raining and standing outside and someone offering him this nice
It was
woman,
a lady, was it?
Yeah, nice old woman offers him an umbrella. And he thanks her. And then says, I designed that building. And then she takes the umbrella and hits him. We have to remember these buildings took a long time for people to catch up with. If you look at the press of Pompidou, particularly Lloyd's, the city hated Lloyd's. It's now grade 1 listed, but when it first opened. And these buildings were really ahead of their time.
I think one of the things that defines Richard's career was his pursuit of a better society. Maybe you could talk a bit about that philosophy and how that changed his architecture.
Yeah, Richard really saw buildings as containers of ideas. And with the generosity the architecture can do to its user, and the giving away of the piazza was to create a generosity to extend function. That really moved into a whole belief in the city and how he could tie the city together. The importance of parks, never islands, never gated, always open, always porous. All the work he did with the Urban Task Force, he did with the Reefs Lecture, which was all about how we can create these much more interlocked cities. In some ways, Richard was a politician as much as an architect, as he had all these ideas and he used his buildings to express the ideas. His ideas of equality, of socialism, of human rights, the right to see the tree, the right to go to the park, the right to look at beautiful architecture, the right to have buildings that could change and be flexible. He talks all the time about always wanting to keep on learning, never wanting to be stuck by the past, but inspired by the future, the power of the landscape and how that can influence our living. And therefore, to see that, we have to make sure the windows are in the right place. He really wanted to be the architect for the people, and he did that maybe most successfully in the urban planning, maybe in some of the bigger civic projects. Where he got closest to that point.
Well, the idea of the piazza was something that reoccurred, obviously the connection to his Italian roots, but in his own Royal Avenue, the house, was that not supposed to be a piazza inside? Or
Yeah, Richard always calls that a public piazza. I always try to say we have a front door, and not everyone knows the code, a lot of people do. Yeah, but he always talks about being born, having sight of Brunelleschi's dome from his window, and the importance of there's no cathedral without a square. Every cathedral has its piazza, Piazza Duomo. So this is a very key to the civic building. But I think it also goes on to this idea of cathedral thinking. He believed in spending enough time designing and pushing the boundaries that the buildings would last for a long time, trying to move away from the high-paced developer building a building which would turn a profit in 10 years and then no longer needed to exist. So the building was for the people, therefore it needed to exist forever. And it may not always be Lloyd's market sitting in there, but the building needed to be of a quality that people would want to inhabit it, and needed to have the flexibility in its core that people could change and transform it.
Abe, how would you like to see this house being used in the future?
For me, this, as we've said, this house contains so much of the DNA of Richard's work, the ideology, the philosophy, the ethos, I would love to see this as some type of foundation where people can kind of come and see the legacy of this thinking of the mind. So the more it can do to be about going inside the mind of Richard rather than about the experience and lifestyle of modern architecture, the better. And I think that's why it's so interesting to work with foundations that have done similar things. I look at Willow Road, and Willow Road doesn't feel like it's frozen or fossilized. Richard should never be frozen or fossilized. He needs to be alive. Willow Road by Goldfinger as being his house, and it really contains the DNA of who that person was. So I would love to see this building containing the DNA of who Richard was, as the architecture contains the DNA of his work.
So it would almost be a foundation to Richard?
I think it'd be a foundation of Richard, containing some of the key drawings of the architecture, telling the story through a kind of an experiential space that people could visit and use and experience.
Before we go, could you tell us a little bit more about your future work and where people could find out a little bit more about yourself and your studio?
Yeah, I mean, Abe Rogers' design is our practice, and we're working closely with the NHS on trying to work on their visions, as well as a series of commercial projects, and some very experimental work in Thailand for Wonderfruit for the festival, which is really about biodegradable architecture. But more closer, we have a nice exhibition opening in March for Wes Anderson in Paris.
In Paris, yeah.
But I suppose most relevant to this is we're working on an exhibition for the So Museum to open in June. And to coincide with that, we're producing a kids' book about Richard's 10 key projects, which we're calling Talking Buildings, which really goes for these 10 key projects and his visions for the city, but it's written to be read by kind of a 6 to 8 year old. So I've been writing it and then reading it a lot to Jay, my 6-year-old, to see if she, to get her level of engagement, and then editing it. And it'll be launched on June along with the So Museum Talking Buildings. Both the exhibition and the book have the same title, Talking Buildings, which hopefully the children will enjoy as well.
Abe Rogers, thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next time on An Architect's Perspective, I'm visiting Villa Tugendhat, Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich's modernist masterwork built in Brno in 1930. With its floating planes, distinctive materials and fluid interiors, Villa Tugendhat exemplifies early modernism. I tour the house with celebrated architect and designer Eva Jerichner, who grew up nearby and brings both personal and professional insight to this landmark building. The full video will be on YouTube if you'd like to watch, or if you prefer to listen, just search for An Architect's Perspective wherever you get your podcasts.